It's a new Congress and a new administration. Both constitutional entities are presenting our industry with challenges and opportunities. Last year and in 2023, NUCA was able to prevent nearly $2 billion in cuts from our industry's two state revolving fund programs. Unfortunately, those proposed cuts are back. One of our top goals in this summit is to prevent a similar catastrophe occurring in the fiscal year 2026 appropriations bill. Work is already underway on this legislation, so this is a good month to be on Capitol Hill talking to lawmakers. We have several other top issues we'll be focusing on at this summit, from workforce development to IIJA reauthorization to lead pipe replacement. Tariffs, immigration, and government reform are also on the table. And of course, we'll be talking about relationship building with your lawmakers. At the 2025 summit, reminding our lawmakers about how important this industry is to every American community is a top-level talking point. Today's issue briefing will be presented by Zack Perconti, NUCA's Vice President of Government Affairs. Thank you for joining us today for this special event. Zack, I turn the webinar over to you.
Thanks, everybody. Looking forward to having everybody join us next week for the Washington Summit here in DC. I'm excited to dive right into our 2025 Washington Summit preview. It's been a very busy time here in DC these last few weeks. There's a lot to cover. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground over this next hour or so, with a goal of which being that by the time we're done with this, everyone will feel very prepared ahead of next week. They'll know what to expect. You'll have a better understanding of the lay of the land here in DC, and you'll be more than ready to come and advocate for the industry when you're on Capitol Hill. Now, some of this information may be familiar to you already. We've covered some of this before in some of the visits that I've done at a number of your chapters, or we discussed at convention. Some of this information will also be repeated next week when we do our on-site briefing, but there's a lot to digest. There's certainly no shortage of big developments happening around our industry in DC, and we want to make sure we have more than enough time to get through everything, answer questions, and really digest what's in store for us when folks are on the Hill. So I'm going to start by briefly summarizing the three different buckets that our asks fall into. These are not in any particular order of importance. This is just kind of the way that everything is roughly divided. Right off the bat, it's not going to be any surprise to anyone. We are looking at the future of utility construction and federal support for utility construction after the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act ends. The last year of the authorization for IIJA is fiscal 2026. So we're coming to the end of that bill's life cycle. And even though the federal government and states still have hundreds of billions of dollars in program funding that they have not actually turned into projects yet, it's important that we keep the pipeline of support going, because if we allow it to lapse, it's going to be nearly impossible to get the federal government to recommit to American infrastructure at the level we need. We know that communities need to make these projects a reality and to meet the demands of American communities and the American economy. So we'll talk about that a little bit. The biggest piece of this bill, or of this effort, is going to be moving alongside the highway bill reauthorization. The surface transportation portion will aim to include a reauthorization of the state revolving fund programs and potentially some other elements of basically a skinny IIJA for a second infrastructure package taking us through the end of the decade. Going alongside that, of course, we need to consider not just having the financial resources to accomplish these projects and to carry out this work, but we also need the people. You know, it's not just about having the money, it's also about having the manpower. We are staring at the edge of a real workforce crisis in this industry. We're already facing difficulties attracting and retaining skilled workers. There is a retirements cliff that is rapidly approaching, especially on the water side. And it's important that Congress act now to set up programs that will help not only the work that we're doing as employers and as the industry, but also our nation's technical and vocational schools, and then even potentially explore some reforms around immigration or seasonal work in order to provide us with the workforce we need, especially in the interim. The last bucket is really kind of a catch-all, but while you're here in DC, we want to make sure that you're building relationships with your lawmakers, you're building connections directly between these congressional offices, and not only NUCA as a national organization, but your chapters as well. And so while there are a few other catch-all issues in this bucket that I'll touch on later on, the biggest thing that's in that last category is coming in ready to tell your story, talk about the things that matter and that are directly affecting you at the local level, and having some sort of hook in every meeting to keep that conversation moving forward. So that is our 10,000 plus foot view of our asks. Before we start to break those down a little bit, I want to update everybody on what's new in Washington, D.C. We just passed the 100-day mark of the new administration and the new Congress. President Trump has been back in the White House for a few months now. We've had an opportunity to get a sense of his priorities, where his administration is going. Just as important, that other co-equal branch that we spent so much time with, the 119th Congress has started to really get its legs underneath it, get a sense of what they want to accomplish over the next 2 years. It is a new environment on Capitol Hill. We have a united government under the Republican Party here in DC. And it's now that we're a few months in that Republican House leadership and Republican Senate leadership have begun to really show their cards on what they want to accomplish over the next 2 years and how they want to work with the White House to carry out the president's agenda. There are a number of opportunities for us, I think, that have already become apparent in this administration. Above all, regulatory and permitting reform are a major priority that both the House, the Senate, and the White House, they all have in common. There are, I think, a number of potential legislative vehicles we're looking at, some even already in the pipeline, to accomplish meaningful permitting reform. There's obviously been a lot made about the president's process of streamlining the regulatory state. He's issued many executive orders aiming to completely reshape the way many of the agencies we work with operate, not only on the permitting side, but also, aiming to improve agency coordination around major construction projects and major federal construction programs. And there is real hope that we might be able to get some sort of streamlined process for project approval, supply chain improvement, and a number of other things that the president has communicated are clearly important to him. Likewise, we are looking at an environment in which many of the unfavorable business and regulatory changes that were made during the last administration are likely to be rolled back. Many of these things we've spent the last couple summits talking about, things on the Department of Labor side, some of the proposed OSHA standards, as well as a whole host of regulatory and tax policies and whatnot that were only done through the executive branch. Many of these things have been already repealed or are in the process of being repealed. That includes a lot of the federal contracting requirements, federal reporting requirements, that we've heard a fair amount of frustration from our membership about. And the hope is many of these reforms may stick. A fair number of these, there is some bipartisan openness to improving the process despite the generally tense environment in DC. And the hope is that for some of the broader ones, if they aren't sufficient to just be done through executive order in the rulemaking process, we may even see Congress moving towards codifying some of these measures. And that's especially relevant on the permitting side of things. Now, switching gears a little bit, really diving into Congress's legislative agenda, there are three things that we've identified immediately that are big opportunities for us and big priorities for them. The first is the reconciliation bill. That is happening now. That is going to be happening next week while everyone's on the Hill. We'll talk about it a little more at the end of this webinar. But that is essentially the one big, beautiful bill that we've heard the president talk so much about. President Trump is aiming to have Congress act on many of his priorities as quickly as possible to just get that stuff done, get it off the table, and allow them to move forward on the many, many other things that are left for them to do. So this bill is something of a catch-all. There are many decisions right now that are being argued over in Congress, even just among the House Republican caucus and Senate Republicans, around funding levels for various programs, what they should allocate additional funding towards, what they need to cut. The main thrust of this package is likely to be both changes to immigration and border security, as well as tax. And for us, it's really that tax piece that we're concerned about. The president's signature bill from his first term in office, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, most of that bill has either already expired or is set to expire within the next 2 years. That includes a number of provisions that are very important, not only to NUCA, but to business associations in general. I've listed 3 of them there. And our hope is that it sounds like those will be included in any sort of final package. More questions than answers about reconciliation right now. I'm not going to spend too much time getting into it. We'll talk about it a little more on site and at the end of this webinar. But the takeaway here is that Congress really needs to get through that before they can do anything else. Now, there are other 2 possibilities, and these tie directly into our asks. Number 1 is, some sort of infrastructure bill. The president has made very clear he wants to do Infrastructure Week again this go around, make it, bigger and better. He is mainly focused on surface construction, though. And our challenge, as always, is going to be to get folks to think beyond what they can see, go beneath the surface, and focus on that essential utility infrastructure that supports those bigger projects. And then workforce development is also a priority for them. One of the things that you will very quickly notice when you're on Capitol Hill next week, or when you talk to anyone in Washington, is that the story of the 119th Congress so far is inextricably linked to the unfinished business of the 118th Congress that wrapped up in December. The 118th Congress was historically unproductive. And I know that's funny to say, this is Congress we're talking about, but even by congressional standards, they actually passed fewer bills, less legislation in the last 118th than most Congresses have going back 50 or 60 years. And so, unfortunately, there are a lot of good bills, including the workforce development bill we'll talk about in a little bit, as well as other priorities for us, like the PHMSA reauthorization, the PIPES Act, which handles damage prevention. There are a number of good bills that were written that made it out of committee, oftentimes with large bipartisan support, and they just weren't put on the floor in time to actually clear the House or the Senate. As a result, when the 119th rolled around, those bills are dead, but we have great legislative language. It's got bipartisan support, and it's just a matter of finding the floor time and encouraging them to put this stuff up for a vote for us to score some very, very major victories for the industry. There are a number of challenges that are also associated with this administration. This is the case with any new administration. You have new opportunities, you have a whole new set of challenges that come with them. Not going to sugarcoat it. Some of these issues that we've been facing these last couple of months are very, very serious. We have made a lot of great progress. I think we have a fairly good working relationship with leadership on the Hill and leadership in the administration. But some of their agenda thus far is not good for utility construction. And I think the way that we change that and message around that largely has to do with education, reading them in on the importance of some of these programs, bringing them up to speed on the work that you all do every single day around the country, and the impact that that has on their constituents. I'll touch on all of these very briefly here. None of this is news to anybody who's on this call. But we're right now struggling with tariffs and supply chain impacts, with questions around the impacts that some of the immigration actions are having on the workforce and broader challenges developing the workforce. Cuts to federal spending are a major challenge, and probably one of the overall themes, frankly, of the summit will be fending off those potential cuts once again. And then, I've heard from folks about the impact that some of the federal funding freezes have had. There have been projects that have been held up, canceled. They've had permits pulled. A number of actions that the administration has taken around federal contracting jobs that frankly are very concerning. And so these are all challenges that we're going to have to address next week. A lot of it really just comes down still to uncertainty. We don't know where the administration is at on some of these issues. And our role really is to come to town as a resource, extending our hands and offering to work through these things in good faith, and to educate about what the realities look like on the ground. Before I really dive into detail, I do briefly want to touch on the tariff question. This is very timely. The president is still actively working through the number of trade deals and whatnot that the administration has promised are coming. We are in the middle still of a pause that was implemented by the administration on a number of the measures that were announced over the last 2 months. However, I am looking at the number of ships that are coming in to the ports on the West Coast. I'm also monitoring, continued developments on the effective rate on certain construction materials, particularly those that are used by the residential construction sector, which does drive a fair amount of activity in our space. And some of these tariffs, some of the impact at this point may be baked in, frankly. And so we are monitoring very, very closely to see what the White House does here, what direction this goes, and to what extent do we need to get involved. Now, I will say that industry largely has been quiet, I suppose you could say, about this. It is an area where there is some risk of antagonizing the administration. They feel very strongly about this approach around global trade. We also know that we do have a number of associate members who are impacted by these tariffs in different ways. And we do need to be cognizant of how this affects all of our members. But we, more than anything, want to make sure that contractors aren't caught in the middle by uncertain announcements around changes in tariffs that directly affect existing bids, existing projects, and the cost of their materials. You've likely already seen this language. I hope you've already seen this language. This is a suggested inclusion that was put out by our legal committee for contractors to review during the process of bidding projects. This is mostly included right now for your awareness. It is very likely that you will be asked about this during a congressional meeting next week. And we'll talk, I think, a little more on site about how you can respond to that. I'll provide another brief update on existing tariff rates and announcements from the administration. This is mostly informational. We do want to make sure that everyone is equipped to respond and knows what's going on. But this is going to impact everyone a little differently. And so really above all else, again, our concern is making sure that the contractor is protected and not caught in the middle by a sudden change in an announcement. So now we're going to get to the meat of things for the summit. There are a handful of bills that everyone should be aware of next week. Most of them, you can see, don't actually exist as far as the 119th Congress is concerned. We are still very early on in this Congress. As I mentioned earlier, until that reconciliation bill moves, a lot of these bigger packages will not be introduced. They won't have any work started on them. We're also very early on in the appropriations process right now. And so those annual funding bills still don't really actually exist yet. What you need to know about really is more of the concept of these bills than the actual legislation itself. And the ones that are most important to us, I would say, are going to be that fiscal year 2026 Interior and Environment Appropriations Bill, a potential reauthorization bill for the state revolving funds, that highway bill reauthorization, which we'll talk about a little more in a bit, and then the Jobs Act of 2025, which is the only one of these that actually exists right now. That's a workforce development bill around short-term Pell Grants for short-term certified vocational training programs. The other two bills that are on here are unfinished business from the 118th. There's the reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act and the Financing Let Out of Water Act. Not listed on here is that PIPES Act, the PHMSA reauthorization bill, which really focuses on damage prevention. That's one of those things that kind of falls into that third bucket of meetings, or of a third category of asks. There are select meetings in which we may ask you to bring that up. House Transportation and Infrastructure had some great language on damage prevention that, while it wasn't perfect, we endorsed and we were able to reach a compromise with for between us, the operators, and a whole lot of the other stakeholder groups. We have language there. We're hoping they're going to move it at some point this year, but it's just not a high enough profile ask for us to really want folks to spend a lot of time on it. It's only really relevant to a subset of the offices we'll be meeting with, and so I'll flag some of those for everyone individually when we're on site next week. I'm going to briefly run through some updated numbers on water infrastructure funding and needs. Do not feel like you need to memorize all of these numbers. Most of these are listed at some point in our fact sheets and our materials. And of course, this webinar is being made available to everyone to review afterwards. I may move through some of these slides relatively quickly, but just know there is something on available for these numbers everywhere right now. So, to set the stage for everyone, we know that America loses trillions of gallons of water a year from outdated infrastructure. That number was true prior to the infrastructure bill passing, and it is still true after a few years of IIJA infrastructure bill. It's still true after a few years of IIJA work having started. The American Society of Civil Engineers released their 2025 infrastructure report card a little while ago this year. They update that report every 4 years or so. And they found that based on their analysis, the grades they gave to America's drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure were unchanged from 2021. And if you do a little digging into the report and you read a little of what they wrote about it, the reason that those numbers are unchanged is largely because of the uptick in federal investment over the last few years. Between the American Rescue Plan projects that are being conducted right now and the uptick in federal support for the state revolving fund programs, we have been able to slowly make a dent in decades of backlog and neglect. If we had not passed the American Rescue Plan and allowed that money to be used for water infrastructure, and certainly if we had not passed IIJA even by itself, those grades would be worse than they were 4 years ago. We are not investing and supporting American infrastructure, and especially American water infrastructure, at the rate that Congress should be. And there's nothing that is makes that more apparent than if you look at the most recent updated numbers from the EPA for drinking water needs and wastewater stormwater needs. If you combine the assessments that were released over the last 2 years, the EPA estimates that there is at least a $1.2 trillion need for water infrastructure over the next 20 years. Two things about that number. Number one, EPA has actually said they think that's an underestimate. they're pretty confident that it's an underestimate, and they're studying for the new reports that they're updating ways to review or to revise their numbers. They will likely find that the real cost is sufficiently higher. And that's partially because, number two, it's a little difficult under their current methodology for them to accurately assess needs more than about a decade out. And so most of that 1.2 trillion in need is really going to hit within the next 5 to 10 years. So we are barreling towards a funding cliff. We do not have nearly the resources available to actually close that demand. Now, I'll go into that in a little more detail in the next couple of slides, but just for everyone to put that into perspective, 1.2 trillion over 20 years in needs. The infrastructure bill allocated around $50 billion in funding for the state revolving fund programs towards meeting those needs. If you just look at the supplemental funding for the DWSRF and the Clean Water SRF, that comes out to around 11 or so billion dollars a year. And then the annual appropriation for both of those combined only comes out to about $2.7 billion. So we are nowhere near where we should be. And we have a long way to go if we're going to make it anywhere close to an improved grade the next time ASCE releases that report card. So just a brief snapshot here. Again, not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I want everyone to know the last time that EPA conducted that drinking water needs survey and assessment, they found a reported needs figure only around the 400 billions. Needs are up 32% in a 5-year period. It is quite likely that we will see another significant jump in the next assessment, which they've already announced they've started. And then on the lead service line front, again, not going to spend a ton of time on this here. EPA thus far is still trying to chart what the path forward is going to be under this administration. There are some questions as to whether or not they will continue with the same pace of replacement that was put into place in 2014 or 2024 towards the end of the last administration. That was targeting a 10% year-over-year replacement starting in 2037, ending in 2027, ending in 2037. But if you look at the infrastructure law, there was only an investment allocated specifically towards lead service lines of about $15 billion. The absolute bottom minimum estimate that I have seen from anybody on the true cost of replacing lead service lines is $45 billion. If you ask some groups like the AWWA, they think it's probably upwards of $90 billion. There is not enough funding available, even with a dedicated set aside, for states that have large numbers of lead service lines to actually comply with that federal mandate. And we have heard that there are some water systems who are essentially plowing every dollar they can find towards those LSL jobs because that's what's required. And while the overall goal and purpose of this requirement is very noble and it's important for public health, it's also important that we are able to do this in a way that's smart, in a way where there's enough resources to truly meet the demand, in a way where if we're upgrading part of a system to replace the lead service lines, we also have funding available to replace the leaky drinking water main that hasn't been fixed up in 60 years. And so, there's very real concerns. Is Congress going to maintain an unfunded mandate that a lot of systems around the country will really struggle to comply with? Now, this is on the clean water side. This is just a distribution to show you what the 2022 Clean Watersheds Needs Survey, which was actually released last year, identified as needs across the country for $630 billion of necessary investment over the next 20 years. It is fairly concentrated. A handful of states, New York, California, Florida, Virginia, Louisiana, and Georgia, actually account for about 42% of the nationwide needs by themselves. But the absolute minimum that any state needs over that next 20-year period is roughly $2 billion in investment. Doesn't sound like a lot, but keep in mind the federal government share here is measured across states in the mere tens of millions of dollars in some cases. And so without adequate investment, adequate support for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, even states whose systems are otherwise in relatively good shape will encounter severe difficulties meeting those needs. And we'll have to resort to things like, major rate increases on consumers, or in many cases, increasing interest rates on projects, which makes it more difficult to fund many of these more jobs across the board. Just as a perspective marker, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in here. I do want everyone to just generally be aware of where we are with state revolving fund allocations from this says the bipartisan infrastructure law, same thing as IIJA. We're going to start calling it IJA more under this administration, same legislation. And you can see we are very close to the end. At this point, funding is starting to really flow out of the administration. And we expect, roughly speaking, that these next couple of years will be the peak of federal activity in actually moving these monies to projects. The reason it is so important that we get that reauthorization done as quickly as possible is we'd like to see us stay at the peak of that parabola there. The longer we wait, the more we will start to see federal spending in the sector drop off. The more challenging it will be to meet needs across the country to get these projects moving. And the more difficult, frankly, it will be to get Congress to agree to a second reauthorization. The most powerful force in Washington is the status quo. Nothing can beat inertia. And if you can keep this going, we have a good shot at making that 8.9 billion, roughly speaking, the new baseline. Now, what's really clear, the more we talk about this, is that federal demands outweigh federal investment. The cost of these requirements that they have put on systems and put onto projects, from not just the regulatory requirements, but even some of the supply chain issues that we alluded to earlier, the rising cost of labor, the rising cost of just doing business in general, means that what the federal government asks from our industry and from utility providers often outweighs what they require, or what they give, I should say. Federal spending on water infrastructure prior to IJA amounted to just 4%. And even with all of this investment that I've talked about, it'll peak at roughly 7% of overall nationwide spending. To make matters worse, we've heard lots from me and from other groups and whatnot in the past about Congress's failure to follow through on the appropriations side. The maximum authorized level of annual spending across both the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds is $3.25 billion. And they have failed to get anywhere near that allocation every single year since IIJA passed, largely saying, we already gave you the largest ever federal investment in water infrastructure. What more could you want? Now, to make matters worse, they've created a pattern here where they're willing to raid that SRF appropriation, which is already less than it should be, to fund specific earmarked projects around the country. And while from a short-term perspective, that's not really a huge problem for us, we're building those projects either way. The challenge it creates is it directly undermines the long-term sustainability of the state revolving fund program. And when Congress is looking or threatening to provide less to that program, and even in the short term, it creates a very real risk of those programs eventually running out of money and becoming insolvent. You are essentially robbing yourself now, or both now and in the future, by giving the short-term win to a specific project without actually complying with the intended role of the program and allowing that money to revolve back into the pool, thus growing for future projects. We have more specific fact sheet and talking point information on this when you talk to offices to talk about how this program is sustainable, how for every dollar of federal spending, it generates $3 in revolving loan funds, how if we were to fully close the water infrastructure gap, we would add $4.5 trillion to the nationwide GDP. These are all things that are very difficult to argue against, but Congress doesn't operate on long-term timescales the way they always should. Sometimes when you're doing these appropriation conversations, they are only thinking ahead to the next fiscal year. And so as long as IIJA supplemental appropriations are there, we're going to continue to have this challenge with the appropriators to fully fund water infrastructure at the level that it's authorized and at the level that it should be funded. The way we really solve this problem, the way we restore stability to project funding, and the way we set ourselves up for a decade of success is to make sure that that SRF reauthorization goes through and that we're not left up to the short-term challenges and desires that are running through the appropriations process. Now, this just got a whole lot more complicated a few days ago. And it's something that we are still actively in the process of responding to. We issued a very strong statement. And we're going to have more materials available for everyone on site. But in some ways, the entire mission of the summit has now been boiled down, if anything, to a single talking point, which is that the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Funds are not only a program or programs with decades of bipartisan success, but they are the bedrock of utility construction, water infrastructure nationwide. And they are funds that states must have in order to keep America's water infrastructure moving. The president's budget request is a suggestion to Congress. That's all it is. It by itself carries no legal authority. It carries no executive authority. It is what it says it is. It is a request to Congress. In many instances and in many Congresses, they will treat it just as that. Structurally speaking, practically speaking, it is not much different than a coalition letter that we or any other association or organization sends to Capitol Hill. It may honestly sometimes even just go straight into the trash. But this is an important marker. It is a sign of where the administration's heads are at right now. And it is in some ways the culmination of the challenge we've had the last 2 years, where folks have suggested cutting the state revolving fund budget because of, if nothing else, the large percentage that it makes up of the EPA's budget, and the fight we've had to restore that funding and appropriations. Not going to sugarcoat this one either. The president's budget request suggests an 89% cut to those programs for fiscal 26, leaving them only with $305 million. That $305 million, according to the rationale there, is a one-year bridge. Fiscal 27, they may move to eliminate this program entirely and completely cut out federal support altogether for the state revolving funds. That would be an unmitigated disaster for our industry, for states around the country, for America's water infrastructure, for public health, and for the economy. And it's particularly frustrating, and we'll get to this a little more on site, because so much of what the administration has said up to this point publicly has been loudly in support of the state revolving fund programs. They talk a lot about this cooperative federalism principle that they are basing many of the agency reforms around. They talk a lot about returning authority and flexibility for many of these programs to the states. The EPA's role in the SRF is to pass much of that money through. It is not an EPA program. These are state programs financed through the EPA, and that is the proper way to think about them. And so much of the rationale laid out on that page is coming about this from a perspective we don't feel is accurate. It shows an importance and need for us, among others, to come into the process as educators and as advocates. Frankly, some of the things in that blurb like calling the SRFs duplicative of that Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, are just simply inaccurate. The WIFIA program can pay for 49% of a project. The other 51% usually comes from the SRFs. And some of the challenges in there, like things being heavily earmarked, they're things that NUCA has been talking about for years at this point. And they are not reasons to eliminate the program. They're reasons to protect the program and strengthen it. This is something we will talk about a lot on site. I don't want to alarm anyone. I don't want anyone to think that the administration is never going to be on our side here and we have no chance of changing this. It is a wrench that was thrown into the process of reauthorization and the appropriations process. And it's going to be a big part of why it's so important for NUCA folks to be in Capitol Hill, not only next week, but all year long, fighting for the work that our industry does and for the programs that enable us to build American infrastructure. So, switching gears, getting us back on track, right? I've talked a lot about an SRF reauthorization. I've touched on how the president has spoken very publicly in support of beautiful bridge and road projects, to use his words. And there is a very pressing desire in Congress to pass another highway bill as soon as possible. The highway bill is basically the one major infrastructure package we would do prior to IJA. It's roads and bridges. That's what it is. That's what it does. It does it fairly well. This is the bill, the vehicle where we talk about things like the Highway Trust Fund. It's very important to us. This is a big chunk of the funding that comes out to water projects, to electric projects, broadband projects, gas projects all around the country. Lots of utility relocation work, lots of utility work in general associated with these transportation jobs. And it is the single largest portion of federal infrastructure spending. $643 billion out of a 1.1 trillion or so IIJA package was just the highway portion. Now, the authorization of this also expires in fiscal 26. And we would be working on this bill anyway, even if SRF authorization were already done. But this provides us with the best possible vehicle we're going to get to move that SRF reauthorization through Congress and any other infrastructure programs that were part of the last bill or that we'd like to see set up. They will move alongside this must-pass bill. It is very likely that Congress will try to get some sort of SRF reauthorization language done, assuming that the budget request doesn't derail that, by hopefully September or so at the latest. And then they'll move on to the highway bill. And just like they did with the infrastructure law, and just like they did with that bill that some of you may remember, our government affairs chairman, Tom Butler, brought up on stage at NUCA convention a couple of years ago, they will attach the SRF bill and any of our other priorities that we've managed to push through to the highway bill, and that will ride straight to the White House. We have a number of priorities that are in this bill that are independent of water infrastructure. Some of these things apply both to the SRFs and to highway projects. I've listed a few of them there. I think this is a great opportunity for us to make some meaningful changes on issues that have, really have impacted us negatively for a long time. It's an issue to push for positive change on a number of different things. It's very, very important to us. This is the vehicle. This is the way by which we secure federal support for our industry for the next 5 years at least to come. So that's just a brief summary of our asks. Fully fund these programs, move towards reauthorization, end the practice of breaking open the piggy bank to pay for projects now. We will talk about these things in detail. They are highlighted on your summit materials. They're very easy to keep track of. But this is essentially just that 10,000 foot, elevator pitch, quick view, mixed metaphor, whatever you want, of what we want folks to actually close their meetings with on this issue. So the rest of this presentation is, believe it or not, relatively quick. I only have a handful of slides left and then we'll get to questions. But I briefly want to touch on workforce development. Now, some of these things may be attached to that highway bill as well, But just to put everything in perspective for everyone, assuming current economic conditions remain the same, and they may not, there are a lot of questions right now as to what the future really holds for us in the next couple of quarters. Assuming things remain on track, we are short roughly 1 million employees in construction as a whole over the next 2 years. Now, that is on top of normal hiring. So those needs really have not gone away. And the last couple of surveys that we've seen have shown that roughly 80% of commercial construction contractors across all sectors of construction still continue to report a moderate to high level of difficulty in finding skilled employees. Now, the president has made a lot of bringing manufacturing back to the United States, and without getting too much into those supply chain issues, it's worth noting that that's not possible if we don't have the bodies there either. And as many of our manufacturer or associate members, no doubt, can also tell us next week, there are those same challenges on that side. There are estimates that we may be short as many as 2.1 million manufacturing jobs by 2030. That could cost the economy $1 trillion in 2030 alone. And to make matters worse, digging down another level into the water sector as a whole, both construction, utility operators, just across the board, roughly 1/3 to half of that workforce is eligible for retirement within the next decade. So this is not a problem that we can afford to wait to solve. And I know that many people on this call are doing great work already to support local programs, to set up employer-sponsored programs, pursuing everything from apprenticeships to partnerships with local trade schools and events like Dozer Day. But it's not enough without congressional support. And there are a number of opportunities here where Congress really can step in and help us out. The biggest one is getting that WIOA reauthorization across the finish line. They nearly included it in the continuing resolution, that government funding bill that kept us open until September of this year. If they had, we wouldn't have had to talk about it. Nearly done, get it across the finish line, help us out a lot. And then there's that Jobs Act, which expands Pell Grant eligibility to qualified short-term workforce development programs. Not everybody needs to go to trade school for a full 2 years to start in this period or in this workforce. There are qualified programs all across the country that can get somebody up and running into a job within only a handful of months, making some of those state certified programs eligible for federal financial assistance would go a long way towards helping people get into this workforce. Lastly, but certainly not least, every industry is asking for individual support. We're no different. The EPA has a grant program that they just issued their first big round of last year, specifically for developing water workforce grants. We'd like to see that continue. That's very important to us to help develop that workforce of the future. And that same ask, by and large, applies also to other sectors of utility construction as well. There are comparable programs in various different federal departments that we'd also like to see support for. Without getting into this too much, we've already talked a little bit about permitting and regulatory reform. The one thing I want to note here is that we've heard a lot from the administration about the push to get America building faster. There have been numerous executive orders that President Trump has issued and signed, directing federal agencies to streamline the permitting process and throwing out largely decades of precedent here, basically telling agencies, start over, this isn't working. Our ask here really is much of this needs to just be done through the legislative process. There's been some progress made there. We talked about this in the debt ceiling deal a couple of years ago. Fiscal Responsibility Act did set a 2-year statutory deadline for NEPA environmental impact statements. They've gotten it down to 2.2 years. It's still not good enough. 61% fail to meet that deadline. There are ways that these changes can be implemented better. The way to do a lot of this is still through legislation, and that's doubly important so we don't ping pong back and forth on definitions and drag out process permitting every single time an administration changes parties. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about Buy America on site. Our ask here which is largely contingent on EPA having available resources to make this happen, is to provide clarity on those requirements, start maintaining lists of products that we know to have been certified, and really just harmonize what the requirement implementation is between offices and between programs. There is no reason why you should have one set of Buy America guidelines to deal with on a project that's under the EPA Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and another under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and another under FEMA, and another under DOT, when it is the same product being used across all of those different jobs. And so we want to, strongly push for that. That's being pushed for in the highway bill as well. We want to make sure that water infrastructure and other utility infrastructure isn't left out of that conversation, and that the federal government puts that requirement into place and then gives the federal agencies the resources necessary to actually implement that and take the burden off of industry for figuring all of this out. I've talked about all of this already. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip it. It is an extremely busy time on Capitol Hill next week. Reconciliation is rapidly starting to ramp up. There are numerous hearings and votes that are likely to be scheduled. We're also in the thick of the appropriations process. Administrator Zeldin will be on Capitol Hill next week to talk through the president's budget request. That is going to be an ugly hearing, especially around those SRF cuts. We're going to make sure that Congress holds their feet to the fire, get those appropriators to stick up for our programs now, and we're much more likely to see those protected when it actually comes time to put something through Congress. You will see this go around, switching gears, that much of our advocacy material has been streamlined in response to member feedback. We still have our good and tried and true fact sheets. You will see those, and we'll review all of those on site. Those are important as leave behinds, but for you this time, we have a couple of documents that are a little easier to refer to. To some extent, you can forget about everything I just said over the last hour, because all of the most important stuff is going to be captured on a postcard. This is the first side of it. This is the second side of it. Most of our key talking points are included there. There will be other supplemental materials. There'll be a one-pager, some other supporting documents that we encourage you to review as you have time. But this is what we want you all looking at when you're in meetings. We're trying to make it as easy as possible for folks. And when it comes to that know before you go, I do want to remind everybody that you are not here to try to just parrot back to lawmakers everything I just said over the last hour. This is an opportunity for you to tell your story. You can tie things back to our materials, but they're there as supporting documents. They're there to make you feel comfortable with what's going on the Hill. You are the industry experts. You're the ones they want to hear about. They want to hear why and how the things that we're debating on Capitol Hill impact you as constituents, as employers, as residents of the communities that they represent and that you work in and employ people from every single day. That's what you're here for. It's not to try to be me, it's to be yourself. And so as you prepare to come to Washington next week, I encourage you, when you have some time, to review some of these materials, but really think about the stories that you would like to tell next week, and how you'd like to see Congress positively impact your industry and address the challenges that you face every single day. Likewise, again, don't feel like you have to know everything right off the bat. Don't feel like you have to cover everything. It takes a long time to run through all this stuff, as you can see. But it's very important when you're in a meeting that when you're telling your story, you resist the impulse to get sidetracked. You don't try to answer questions you're not comfortable answering or that you don't know. Frankly, one of the best things that I think can happen in any congressional meeting is, having to say, I'm not sure of that right now, or let me check on that. I'll follow up with you, because that keeps the opportunity, or that gives you the opportunity to keep the conversation moving forward, and to follow up. These meetings are about presenting yourself as not only an advocate for the industry, but as an expert resource for Congress to go to whenever they have questions, to present yourself as key stakeholders, as pillars of your communities, which you all are, folks that they should know about, know to contact, know to keep in touch with. That's how we make change in Washington. It's not just through the facts and the figures. We have all of that on our side. It's about the people, it's about the relationships, and it's about just educating folks about who we are, what we do, and why we're so important to this country and to everyone's everyday lives. Now, we're mostly going to cover schedule and logistics on site. There are just a couple of things that I want everyone to be aware of. This slide is both schedule and logistics and know before you go. I want everyone to make sure when they're prepping their materials, number one, make sure that you have the simple stuff, your business cards, make sure you've had a chance to, just briefly read through some of the fact sheets. Please make sure that you have a real ID or another TSA compliant ID as of earlier this week. That may mean a passport. Now, obviously, most of you are going to be flying to get here. TSA is likely going to gradually phase in real ID enforcement. You may just be subject to extra screening if you don't have the little star on your driver's license yet. We do not know if Capitol Police will be the same. They may be very strict about that requirement. It is now a requirement to enter all federal buildings. And I don't want any of you to be in the position where you're denied entry to the Capitol building itself because you don't have a real ID that's compliant with the new federal standards. That's not to say that you will necessarily need that. You may very well only have meetings in the House and Senate office buildings for which you don't need to show ID. But it's just something that we'd like everyone to be aware of. And so I wanted to make sure to note it while I was speaking. When it comes to the schedule itself, we start bright and early on Tuesday the 13th with committee meetings, 7:30 a.m. There's a number of meetings that run all morning into the board of directors meeting that starts at 12:30. After 12:30, we'll go until 1:30 in the meeting, regional board meetings until 2:45. Very pleased to announce to everyone we did receive confirmation this afternoon that starting at 3:30, we will be joined by the acting assistant administrator of the EPA Office of Water. We're very much looking forward to welcoming them, hearing their perspective. They'll also be visiting us with us a little later that week. But that will mean that our briefing and our government affairs session is a little compressed. So, apologies if I've eaten too much into the question time. This is probably going to be our longest chance to talk, depending on how long the EPA is available. We'll roll into our networking reception with the national partners until 6:30 p.m. And then the next morning, we're going to be very pleased to welcome the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee and a member of the House Oversight Committee, Congressman Jim Jordan. He is a friend to NUCA, Ohio. His committee has jurisdiction over immigration law. That is one of the things we'd like to hear him talk about is just general thoughts on reforming seasonal visas, seasonal workforce policies, making sure that our folks are able to use those programs when we need to, as well as how, as a member of House Oversight, they are getting agencies back on the track for shovels in the ground and getting those remaining infrastructure dollars moving. Chairman Jordan is very close with the administration, and we're looking forward to having him join us. Our meetings will be running from 9:30 a.m. roughly until 4:30 p.m. And then once again, we're very pleased. We will be hosting our closing reception once again in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee room from 5 to 6:30 p.m. And we hope to be joined by both Chairman Sam Graves and Ranking Member Rick Larson, who will welcome folks to that event. We'll talk more about all the schedule and logistics on site. It's going to be a great event. We've got a great number of folks registered, a good number of meetings so far that are confirmed. My final ask, if there are executive directors listening in, please do make sure to include your meetings on the master spreadsheet on WeDigAmerica.org as soon as possible. That helps me plan for any supplemental material. That helps me plan for knowing what meetings that I may want to attend alongside some of the national leadership. And that's how I can keep track of any follow-ups we need to do. Last but certainly not least, before I get to questions, I do want to mention the other very exciting event that's going on at the same time. We are once again participating in the celebration of construction on the National Mall. It's going to be a great event. We're basically taking over half of the mall, just steps from the Capitol building, in conjunction with a number of our allied trade associations, as well as a number of our equipment manufacturer national partners. This is going to be a great way to build on the work we've done at Summit. Fortunately for us, this time it starts the same day as our Hill visits. Some folks may remember when we did this a couple of years ago, it started on Monday and ended Wednesday. This time it goes Wednesday through Friday, but we're expecting a great turnout. We have had confirmed the Secretary of Transportation should be there. A number of other high-ranking federal officials may be there. Lots of members of Congress will be there. And we may also be joined again by some of those folks from the EPA at our booth as well. NUCA's got a great location on the booth for our booth. We encourage folks in their meetings as you're leaving to invite folks, both staff and members of Congress, to attend the event. If they don't already have a tour scheduled, we can certainly help facilitate one. But it's just a great way to keep not only Congress and the administration's attention on what we do, but also to raise awareness for the general public. It's really neat when you get to take over the National Mall like that. So more to come on that on site. Now we are past our time. I know some folks have to drop off. I do not. I'm happy to answer questions, and I see we already have at least one in the chat.
Thank you, Zach. Let's start with the question in the chat. Everyone can certainly ask questions via the chat, or you can certainly unmute yourself and ask it verbally. Just remember, remute yourself afterwards. Zach, do you think there will be language about the elimination of DEI attached to any of the updated bills they are looking to pass?
Good question. Potentially. It is more likely that we will see many of the changes around things that are deemed DEI related. Most of that is going to be done administratively through the executive branch for two reasons. Number one, unless it's in the reconciliation bill, Democrats do still have the ability to filibuster. And depending on the language in question and how far it goes, it's quite likely that somebody in the Senate Democratic caucus will step up and say they're not comfortable with it and they'll filibuster it. Now, most of the things that some folks would describe as DEI language that are part of the infrastructure law or even just federal regulations in general, those are not actually required through legislation. Those are administrative requirements, regulatory requirements that were put into place either through formal rulemakings or through guidance by the last administration. And that's largely why President Trump has been able to gradually at times or very quickly at others begin the process of removing a lot of those requirements or grant language or programs that were put into place under the last administration. So some of the things that may have slowed down implementation of federal infrastructure rollouts, because they don't have that legislative basis, the incoming administration has basically, very quickly decided to pull existing guidance and eliminate some of that language as a condition of moving or as a prerequisite to moving these dollars out the door. Now, this is a gradual process. There are things like some of the DBE requirements and whatnot on federal contracting where they have not directly been removed yet. It is quite likely that they may be on the chopping block. It is the sense of some of the agencies that some of those federal contracting requirements may be in conflict with the president's executive orders. And if there's no legislative basis, they need to figure out, how to make those programs compliant with those executive orders. But that's going to be the main arena. It's not going to happen quickly, and it's probably mostly going to be through executive action rather than any bill that stands a good chance of moving through law.
Are there any other questions? Zach, I think you've been as comprehensive as you always are with these presentations.
That's very kind of you, Bob.
All right, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and for your time. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. I know we're over by about 5 minutes. Zach, thank you very much for your time today to present this information to our guests. We would also like to thank our many national partners for their continued and very kind support of NUCA and our advocacy efforts on behalf of the American utility construction industry. Today's webinar has been recorded. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube channel and on the Summit website hopefully by close of business Friday. And thank you for your time today to join us for this special industry webinar and for supporting NUCA. Please remember to refer to our summit website, WeDigAmerica.org, for information about the May Washington Summit. That's WeDigAmerica.org. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your week and have a safe travel to DC next week.